the most recent program in the Zoominar series on language, society, and education, which is hosted by Universitas Negeri Jakarta. Before I go any further, as usual, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Jakarta. I try to find a new interesting piece of information each month. And very recently, a Ph.D. student from Indonesia who's studying at the Free University in Amsterdam did some research on temperatures and rainfall in Jakarta in 1900 and 2000, 100 years difference. And he found that temperatures have increased by 1.6 degrees over the last century. And when temperatures increase, the air becomes more humid. It absorbs more water. So when it rains, it means there's more water that has to come out of the air. And this explains why we have longer rainy season, and the rain is much heavier now than it was 100 years ago. So the amount of water that comes down in one day is now much more than 100 years ago. So that's my interesting piece of news about Indonesia. I'll invite Ibu Arita now to open the session, and then Pak Rektor, if he is available.
Thank you. Thank you very much, I will, for giving me opportunities to speak here. Good afternoon from Jakarta. Distinguished keynote speaker, resource person, rector of UNJ, board of directors of Postgraduate of UNJ, and participants from many parts of the world. My name is Arita Marini. As Deputy Director in International Collaboration Aware, I'm representing the director to give welcoming remarks into this session. He's currently on another agenda. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our monthly international program in 2022 related to language, society, and education. What an honor to have you join us in this month's Zoominar program hosted by Postgraduate of UNJ. The scope of this monthly international program may cover an international level of topics, but we often link it with Indonesian contexts in the hope of obtaining insights from our international colleagues, as well as providing a discussion platform for our students here in Indonesia and those who are passionate in these topics. Our topic this May is focusing on unplanned language policies in Cote d'Ivoire, and our respected keynote speaker, Paulin Djite, from University Felix, West Africa, have joined us now in this session. Hello, Paulin. Good afternoon from Jakarta.
Good afternoon.
He will discuss about the role of local languages as a fundamental tool to help building resilience in the face of recent challenges in the Cote d'Ivoire through a number of unplanned language policy initiatives. We also thank Hywel Coleman, who has coordinated this webinar and in charge of being our moderator for this session. Once again, thank you very much for allocating your time to speak in our session today, Paulin Djite. Without further ado, I wish you a fruitful discussion and thank you for your attendance and participation in this month's international program. We have here join us our Honorable Rector, Professor Komarudin. He will be giving his remarks. Professor Komarudin, the screen is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Honorable Speaker of the Zoominar program, Mr. Paulin Djite. Good afternoon, Mr. Paulin.
Good afternoon.
Research Professor of SocialLinguistic at University Felix, Africa. Mr. Hywel Coleman, the moderator, Professor Arita Mariani, Vice Director Operation Program, yes, and the Board of Vice Director, lecturers, and all students of postgraduate program. I am pleased to welcome you all at this monthly seminar program with an interesting topic: unplanned language policies in Cote d'Ivoire. Like other topics in the previous webinar, I believe this topic is very interesting. This is possible in the context of Indonesia, in which some challenges and opportunities are facing ahead. In one hand, we are proud about the development of Bahasa Indonesia with this data. One, Bahasa Indonesia is now taught and learned in 45 countries in the world. Two, Bahasa Indonesia is the second language in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Three, Bahasa Indonesia is the fourth most popular language in Australia. Four, the popularity of Indonesia Wikipedia ranked 26 among hundreds languages worldwide. However, on the other hand, problems are arising with our local language. There are at least 718 local languages used in Indonesia nationwide. Some of them are endangered, and even a few have been considered dead. In this context, I would like to invite Dr. Paulin Djite to have a joint research with our lecturer and the language policy in context of Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, in the end of my speech, on behalf of Universitas Negeri Jakarta, I must extend my gratitude to Mr. Paulin Djite for sharing his expertise in this webinar. I hope in the near future, when situation is getting better, a face-to-face seminar can be had here in Universitas Negeri Jakarta. My appreciation also goes to Mr. Coleman, who has been with us in Universitas Negeri Jakarta holding the monthly webinar. I must also extend my gratitude to the Director of Postgraduate Program and the Board of Vice Director, and also all the coordinator of the study program who have made this event possible. Ladies and gentlemen, especially lecturers and students of postgraduate program, please enjoy this webinar. I am very sure you can take benefit from it. As a request to open this seminar, with your permission, I declare this seminar officially open. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'd just like to say a few words to introduce our speaker, Professor Paulin Djite. He's in a rather special situation. He's a specialist in social linguistics, but he also knows a lot about development, more than most of us who claim to talk about language and development. He actually practices it. He's a consultant to the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank, sorry. He's particularly well known for one of his books, which is called The Social Linguistics of Development in Africa. It was published in 2008, and it's very well known. It had a big impact on me when I first read it. And one of Paulin's arguments is that countries that are not developing quickly are often held back by their language policy. The language policy gets in the way of development. Paulin actually has an interesting connection with Indonesia. You'd be surprised to hear. His son is called Bruce Djite, and he played with PSM Makassar football team between 2018 and 2019. So there's a family connection with Indonesia. So I'll invite Paulin to start his presentation. Can I ask you, as usual, to switch off your videos, please, and your microphones so that we get a stronger link. The time for the presentation is approximately 40 minutes, so that we have some time at the end for questions and discussion. So thank you, Paulin.
Thank you very much, Haiwa. Thank you to all. It's a great pleasure to be given the opportunity to talk to you today. The topic, as it has already been announced, is on unplanned language policies, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire. And I will be giving you a few examples of what I mean by that. But let me start with a general statement. It's been noticed that academics such as ourselves get so much involved in the intellectual process of theoretical complexities that we do not always find the time and space to reflect on what they do and on what we do and why we do it. Of course, theory in linguistics, in sociolinguistics, as in any other subject, is a passage obligé, as they say in French, in every scientific endeavor, because you need theoretical concepts. They are crucial to build an understanding of the subject matter that you're dealing with. But at the same time, theories also need to be subjected to ongoing re-examination, and they need to be constantly put to the test. In other words, we, and by we I mean academics, must always ask themselves how theory impacts the lives of their fellow citizens. What is it that sociolinguistics can do for our society is the main issue, in my view. And so the study of language in society necessitates building a solid theoretical knowledge, not only in linguistics, but also in other social sciences. And as I go on with my argument, you will see where I'm coming from. I wonder if I can now share my slides. Okay. Are you able to see the slides?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. All right. In this first slide, I'm just quoting Joshua Fishman when in the first editorial of the Sociology of Language, he wrote that we must not shrink from applications, for without the test of the real world of social complexity, it is even impossible to evaluate theories properly, let alone come to grips with social responsibilities. But how do I go here? I'll need to move this forward. Right. Yes. It is, to me, Fairclough who expresses this best when he says that sociolinguistics is very strong on the what questions. That is to say, what are the facts of variations. But sociolinguistics is weak on the why and the how questions. In other words, why are the facts the way they are? And how, in terms of development of social relationships of power, was the existing sociolinguistic order brought into being? How is it sustained? And how might it be changed to the advantage of those who are dominated by it? Fairclough goes on to say that the general insensitivity of sociolinguistics towards its own relationship to the sociolinguistic orders it seeks to describe is the very problem that we have to face as specialists in sociolinguistics. And he says, when one focuses on the simple existence of facts without attending to the social conditions which made them so, and the social conditions for their potential change, then the notion that the sociolinguist herself might somehow affect the facts hardly seems to arise. The effect of sociolinguistic research might either be to legitimize these facts, and so indirectly the power relations which underlie them, or to show the contingency of these facts despite their apparent solidity, and so indirectly point to ways of changing them. Now, what is meant here, is that sociolinguistic research needs to expand to consider not only the language issues at issue, but also the social landscape in which they occur. That is a quote from Tollefson. But my take on it is that it's not just the social landscape in which they occur, but the socio-economic and political landscape in which they occur. And today I will be focusing on the economic environment in which languages exist. Many academics have been trained in the tradition of sociolinguistic research that seeks to establish the facts and refrains from asking the why and the how questions. But experience shows that in the developing world, which is the case for Cote d'Ivoire and Indonesia, and especially in the case of Africa, this bias has led to a trend, if a sad trend, where research is limited to frameworks dictated by constraints, such as the sources of funding or target publication outlets, often overlooking the reality of day-to-day interactions. So you will get a grant from, in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, from a French research institute, but your research will have to show the importance of French in Cote d'Ivoire, rather than focus on a national language of Cote d'Ivoire, for instance. So the few African researchers who managed to break the shackles and accepted of the accepted theories and wisdom are often derided and ridiculed. I recently published a paper in the International Journal of the Sociology of Language, where I brought out some statistics of the various publications done by African researchers on African languages in international journals of sociolinguistics around the world. And the statistics show very poor, very low interest of local sociolinguists in their own languages. Most of their publications concern the languages imposed from the outside: French, English, Portuguese, Spanish, etc. It is in this vein, therefore, that I will be presenting practical examples of how some local languages are being rediscovered as a fundamental tool to help build resilience through a number of what I call unplanned language policy initiatives that are aimed at helping the populations prepare and address recent tragedies and adversities on the ground here in Cote d'Ivoire and elsewhere, but I will focus on Cote d'Ivoire. In any case, Professor Coleman told me that this should be a conversation. So to get into the gist of the topic of today, I thought that I'll start the discussion as a conversation. Since many of you have not heard of Cote d'Ivoire before, I'll just be asking you a few questions. My first question would be, and anybody can say whatever comes to mind, what comes to mind when you think of Africa? If you can give me a few examples. What sorts of ideas, right or wrong, prejudices? We are among academics, so don't hesitate.
Beautiful countries?
Beautiful country, very nice. Yes?
Big city.
Any negative images?
No. I was going to say big cities.
Big cities, yep.
Yeah. Oh, Kathleen, you is here. The home of at least 30% of the world's languages.
Okay, the home of at least 30% of the world languages. But I'll focus on some economic data for you, or some socio-political data for you. Things that people think, but maybe will not say, because they are true 90% of the time. Famine is one of them, isn't it? Low education is one of it. Poor health is one of them. Corruption is one of them. Multidimensional poverty, bad governance, all right? You hear about military coups. You hear about conflicts within countries, among countries. Recent example, Ethiopia. You have the natural resource curse. Lots of countries with a lot of oil or diamond or gold, but very unstable socially and politically. A predominance of the informal sector in the national economies, an over-concentration on export goods with dependence on natural resource exports. We export everything: timber, oil, gold, diamonds, whatever you can think of. But we do not transform any of those. We export them as is, and then we buy them back as finished products at a higher price than the price at which we sell them. We have a very low economic diversification. Once a country has got oil, they don't care about any other sector of the economy. That's a generalization, of course. High unemployment, weak private sector, and severe social and gender inequalities, just to give you a few examples. Now, my second question is as follows. Is Africa a poor country, a poor continent, sorry? What would be your answer if you were asked that question? On the surface of it.
Not all of them.
Not all of them. However, in the news, in Indonesia or anywhere else outside of the continent, all you hear about is the aid, the loans, the grants that are being given to Africa. And yet, this is the same continent that possesses 30% of bauxite, global, 60% of manganese, 75% of phosphates, 85% of platinum, 80% of the world chrome, deposits of chrome, 60% of cobalt, 30% of titanium, 75% of diamonds, and nearly 40% of gold. Furthermore, it is in this continent that you find major oil producers. Nigeria, 1.36 million barrels per day. Libya, 1.17 million barrels per day. Angola, 1.14. Algeria, 874,000 barrels per day. Egypt, Congo, Ghana, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Chad. In the current situation of the war in Ukraine, countries have been courting North African countries such as Algeria to import gas because they are not going to get enough gas from Russia. This is the kind of potential we're talking about. I will give you a more recent example of the contradictions in the picture of the continent and the reality of the continent. And my third question in that case would be, what do you know about Mali? You must have heard of Mali recently. What have you heard? Okay, I'll answer it for you. You probably think of Mali as a very poor country, as a country invaded by jihadists in the north. You also heard about the French army intervention to stop the jihadists in the north of Mali. And you probably heard of the coalition of European countries sending soldiers to dislodge the jihadists in Mali. You will have heard of the 2 military coups in 2020, of the 3 coups d'etat in 2012. You will have heard about what the Western media called the Wagner mercenaries in Mali. And you will also have heard that the French army has recently been asked to leave the country. Yet, you have not heard about the fact that Mali is the 8th largest country in Africa, with an area just over 1,240,000 square kilometers. In other words, Mali alone is more than twice the land surface of France and Belgium put together. With a population of only 19 million people, 67% of whom are estimated to be under the age of 25. Now, what about Mali? In Mali, there is what is called the Taodeni Basin, which stretches from the northern borders with Algeria and Mauritania south to the river Niger, and which is estimated to contain vast oil and gas reserves. Over 15 companies, international companies from Australia, Canada, the US, Ireland, the United Arab Emirates, France, Spain, Italy, and Qatar have been involved in activities related to the Taodeni Basin, which is known as the El Dorado of petroleum reserves in the world. Mali is also the 4th largest producer of gold in Africa, behind Ghana, South Africa, and the Sudan. So what do you think the challenges are in view of the preconceived ideas that are floating everywhere in the press and on the TV channels? I just posted a slide to help you with some of the general ideas about the continent and about the challenges that the continent faces. And they include the post-colonial economic structure that we have inherited with countertop economies, such as the situation I described earlier, with all the raw materials that are being exported, a heavy reliance on revenue from natural resources, reliance on foreign assistance, and then competitive private sector, low economic diversification, industrial and underdevelopment, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we need to also look at the fact that even though some countries like Cote d'Ivoire, because that's what we're going to be talking about, Ghana and Cameroon, these 3 countries alone produce 70% of global cocoa in the world. And the continent has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. And yet, Africa imports most of its food, rice, for instance, from Southeast Asia. So fragility is rooted in the continent's state and society, because there is clear incapacity to address deep-seated social, economic, infrastructure conflicts and gaps, and is very much exposed to any external shock. With the war in Ukraine, for instance, there are claims that some African countries will face famine because they will not be able to receive any wheat from Ukraine, let's say. But how many African countries rely on wheat for food? In any event, the pressures are multidimensional and have very serious implications for the socioeconomic well-being of the African continent. Many analysts will tell you that this is entirely due to a poorly developed economy, low levels of manufacturing, a post-colonial economic structure that has remained virtually unchanged. And yet there is so much untapped potential. At this stage, you must be thinking, are we listening to a sociolinguist or are we listening to a political scientist? And the reason for this approach to my analysis is just one question. And the question is the how. How do we strengthen the continent's capacity to address these pressures that I've just spoken about? And I'll say, what if I told you that 60 years later, an important later, and I mean in terms of countries gaining independence, many countries in Africa have been independent for at least 60 years now. But an important ingredient in achieving inclusive growth in developing countries, in my opinion, is missing. So what if I told you that language is that very important ingredient? I have always argued that I know of no country in the world that has been able to develop itself using the language of someone else, using a foreign language. And this is typically the case in Africa. I think that Indonesia has made great strides with Bahasa Indonesia because you are halfway there. We are still behind you, and we need to take your example. The key argument here is essentially that language can be a driver of economic fragility. It can be a driver of poor educational standards. It can be a driver of poor health. It can be a driver of bad governance. I don't know what happens in the hospitals of Indonesia. I can only imagine, but I'm quite familiar with Laos, where my wife is from. And I know that when you go to a hospital in Laos, you don't have to speak English or French or Chinese or even Thai. You speak Lao. The doctor speaks Lao to you. And I'm sure in Indonesia, when you go to the hospital, you don't need to speak English to your doctor. You will speak Bahasa Indonesia. Well, in most countries in Africa, if not all, you go to the hospital, you will have to speak French or English or Portuguese or Spanish to your doctor, because all the doctors have been trained in those foreign languages. If you don't speak those languages, you will have to have a family member to interpret your conversation with the doctor, with all the risk of medical errors. And so my argument is that language is the cross-cutting bind that can help build and strengthen the continent's capacity to address these sort of issues. And of course, there are efforts that are being made. And it's not new. Recently, and I say recently in terms of the occurrence of various policies, the latest that we've got is what they call the Charter for African Cultural Renaissance, the Africa We Want, where the African Union advocates, among other things, the learning of African languages in its Articles 18 and 19. And that's what I have here for you. The first, Article 18, and the second, Article 19, where the willingness of using African languages is clearly expressed. And as I said, this is not the first document of its kind. And it has to be said as well that some countries like Senegal or Mali or Guinea or Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, to cite just a few, have made headway in the promotion of their national languages. Although the vast majority of African countries have not taken any concrete steps to solve that or to address this question. And this is where the examples come, because as it just happens in Cote d'Ivoire, especially, but not only, it's been noticed over the years that the results of students in schools and universities have been getting worse. The outcome has been getting worse. And it's forced politicians to start thinking about the possibility of introducing national languages in the education system, if only as pilot projects in some cases. And I have here a statement from the Minister of Education of Cote d'Ivoire, making this statement at a symposium that took place just the last month in April, where she says, "We're aware that we participate in the writing of a new page for bilingual education in our country. Despite appearances, bilingualism is the source of an invaluable treasure because our children have a relationship with the world that is enriched by the diversity of our linguistic and cultural references. That is why it would be absolutely useless to build a pedagogical strategy that does not rely first on the achievements of the sociocultural environment of the learner through the use of the medium that is his or her mother tongue." Now, the use of the mother tongue in the educational system, I'll remind you, was put forward by UNESCO before I was born. And so if you think I'm old, you will realize how old this principle has been advocated. Now, this is going to be implemented in 37 schools throughout the country, and it's going to be done in the 4 major regional language groups of the country, namely, for those of you who know a little bit about the linguistic composition of Cote d'Ivoire, the Mandé languages in the northwest, the Senufo languages in the north, the Kru languages in the southwest, and the Kwa languages in the southeast. I just heard that from the professor that there are 700 languages in Indonesia. In Cote d'Ivoire, we don't have that many. They are estimated at 60. But even then, my research over the years has argued that we don't have that many languages in reality, and that the ones that can be said to exist are actually 4, and those are the 4 that I just mentioned. But in the traditional description of languages here, they call them language groups or regional languages. The second example I have for you, again, is about, I'm playing around with the slides. Right, okay.
Paulin, can I interrupt
Yes?
for a second? I think we have about 10 minutes to go. Is that okay?
I'll be done by then.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The second example is a recent measure which was initiated by the Ministry of Transport in Cote d'Ivoire that will allow from now on anyone who can neither read nor write in French, but who speaks one of the 3 dominant national languages to receive training in that language to learn the highway code. In other words, to be able to drive now, to have a driver's license, you don't need to have to speak French, which was the requirement in the past. It's now being open to people who do not speak the French language, but who speak these 3 dominant local languages that are mentioned here: Baoulé, Bete, Jula. Now, why was this decision taken? Well, it was hastily decided about October last year, 2021, because there has been, in that year, a spate of fatal accidents, which were caused mainly by individuals who were driving either without a license or who had a license on them, but had clearly not learned how to drive. With the rampant corruption, people would just walk into a driving school and buy themselves a driving license and go around driving. And yet, it is a fact in this country that having a driving license is a major accomplishment in order to get employment. Being a driver is regarded as a well-paying job in this country. And yet, with 59% of the population being illiterate, the requirement until last year was that you had to read and speak French in order to get a driving license. Therefore, holding back the majority of the population simply because they didn't speak French. Now, my third example, which is actually a counter example, and I'm going to, is from the African Development Bank, where I'm currently a consultant. And the African Development Bank has identified the fact that women entrepreneurs in Africa face 3 key challenges, namely a finance challenge, a capacity challenge, and a business environment challenge. And part of this challenge is because most of these women, especially in the small and medium enterprises, are self-made business women who speak no French, but are successful in their businesses. The result is that when they approach banks, either for loans or for any other financial support, they cannot get it because they cannot fill out the forms. They don't have a bank account, et cetera, et cetera. And so the bank decided to help these women to get into, to get more help from the banks. And so they have, within the African Development Bank, an organization called the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, AFAWA, which is trying to help women get a chance to get credit from the banks. However, AFAWA is asking these women entrepreneurs, once again, most of them do not speak or write English or French, but they are asking them to submit their proposals in English or in French, including the project rationale, the description of the beneficiaries, the cost structure and finance plan, the analysis and development outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, before the applicants can write such proposals, they would have to demonstrate, or they will need to have the ability to speak French or English. This we spoke about that. Now, okay, this is what leads me now to my concluding remarks that will take a minute or two. So once again, how do we strengthen the continent's capacity to address these contradictions and these pressures? Of course, we can't be naive about this. I'm not suggesting that multilingualism alone will solve all the problems of structural inequalities in society, be it here in Africa or elsewhere in the world. But what I try to demonstrate is that we are operating within the realm of uneven access to knowledge production and hegemonic Western visions of language and society. We must remember, and we need to remember, that language is a terrain of struggle for access, for selection, and for the uneven distribution of symbolic and material goods. In the case of Africa, some languages have simply not been allowed to flourish, as have others, especially foreign languages. It is also the case that evidence of literary tradition in some languages has intentionally been destroyed. It's not as if Africa never had a written system. You will have heard of the Timbuktu manuscripts, or you will have heard of the Ajami script. These are traditions that were purposefully destroyed by the colonizers, and that are still possible to rebuild, but no one will invest into those. So these are the sorts of social responsibilities that African linguists face in the area of language policy and planning. Hopefully, with the recent unplanned language policies that I've just spoken about, whereby countries realize that they have to bring everybody under the same tent. In other words, make it possible for the majority of the population to participate in the development of the country. So that's why I'm saying that asking the why and the how, and asking the crucial questions about whether a theory allows you to get a better grasp of what language does to society and its speakers, and further, about which theory or theories perpetuate ideologies of language and what consequences they may entail for how speakers are located, categorized, stratified, and differentiated in society is very important. What does it do to our society in general? This is very important. And it is with glee that I see that in Cote d'Ivoire, the decision makers have finally realized that if they insist on only French as the official language for people to do what they do on a daily basis, it's not gonna lead the country anywhere in terms of development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paulin. Very, very stimulating presentation, and very different from what we've heard in previous Zoominar sessions, and quite different from an awful lot of research and writing in the field of language and development, because it's so strongly informed by information about the economic and social context. Would anybody, I can't see any questions in the chat box yet. If anybody would like to put something in the box or speak directly, please go ahead.
Faisal.
Yes, silakan. Ibu Nina.
Bon, terima kasih Pak Howell. Est-ce que je pourrais parler français, Monsieur Philippe?
Oui, bien sûr.
Ah, d'accord.
Oui, vous pouvez parler français, oui.
Mohon izin Ibu Bapak sekalian, saya akan berbicara bahasa Prancis. Ini pertanyaan bahasa Prancis. Bon, je parle français parce que je suis professeur de français en Indonésie et notamment pour niveau licence et pour niveau master et niveau doctorat. Moi, je suis coordinatrice de programme doctorat pour linguistique appliquée. Bon, une petite question. Comment, pour politique linguistique, notamment pour les variations linguistiques des jeunes dans l'apprentissage du français au Côte d'Ivoire, et puis la position de langue maternelle entre français et anglais.
Oui.
Pak Faisal, Pak Howell, saya akan bahasa Indonesia saja, sekaligus bagaimana variasi bahasa untuk anak-anak muda dalam pembelajaran di Côte d'Ivoire. Voilà, c'est ma question. Monsieur Philippe.
Merci. Her question is about the place of mother tongues in the education system, I suppose, compared to French, and she also mentioned English. And the answer is quite straightforward. In Cote d'Ivoire, as in most French-speaking countries in Africa, the education system is essentially in French, period. When the child goes to school at age 6, whether they spoke French at home or not, they have to learn in French. The mother tongue is not part of the education system at all. That's the simple answer. Now, if you are good enough to make it through primary school and you go to high school, English, German, and Spanish are introduced as second languages. It is assumed that French is your first language, which of course it is not. So that's the answer to your question.
C'est-à-dire le français, c'est la première langue, c'est ça?
Absolument.
Ah, c'est ça. Depuis
la première année, depuis la crèche.
Ah, d'accord. Bon, terima kasih Pak Howell Coleman Pak Faisal Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Paulin, Djite.
Merci, merci.
Good, thank you. So our seminar is becoming multilingual. Any more comments or questions in any language you wish to use? I can make an observation, Paulin, about.
Can I just say before you
yeah.
make your observation that
Yeah.
the role I play at the African Development Bank is quite interesting, because the bank has realized that they have development projects everywhere around the continent, and there are in most places they have a communication problem, because the communities, since they have to do a socio-economic analysis of the area where they have to implement the project, they need to communicate with the local populations. And the local populations, most of the time, do not speak French or English. And so how do you explain the project to the local population to get their buy-in, right? That's the kind of role that I play with the African Development Bank. In other words, they have realized that the languages of the communities that will benefit from the project have to be taken into account, and that the communication process has to include those languages. Otherwise, it won't get anywhere.
Thanks. I see Kathleen has a couple of questions.
Yeah,
Kathleen?
I can speak to those. Paulin, the one question I wondered about was that the organization, the African Academy, or the Academy of African Languages, which was recognized by the African Union, did for a number of years look as if it had a promising future. What has happened to that academy, and does it still have projects, or has it succumbed?
To be quite honest, I think it has. To be quite honest, I think it has succumbed. They are now located in Dakar, Senegal, but there is practically no activity that I've heard of. And I've been back here for the last, 10 years now? Nothing.
Yeah. That was my impression, but I just hadn't been able to
just a political body, in my opinion, not a body of linguists.
Yeah, yeah. And the other question is something that you in fact did refer to, but it's something that I feel that seems to be very prevalent at the moment, and that is that scholars in African countries, in order to keep their jobs, have to publish. They have to be cited. And the only chance that their work will be cited will be if they cite European and North American scholars. They will not be cited if they only cite African scholars. So they're caught in this horrible conundrum. You either refer to African research, which you might feel very committed to, but then no one's going to cite you. And then your university is going to say, well, we can't offer you tenure because you're not being cited and you're not publishing enough.
Well, but they also say, at least here in Cote d'Ivoire and in most French-speaking countries, that your publications in African journals are not rated at the same level as your publications in European or American journals.
Exactly.
So if you publish in IJSL, for instance, yes, that gets a big nod. But if you publish in an African journal, it's a waste of time, basically.
So I'm wondering if the same phenomenon exists in Indonesia, for example.
Yes, it's the same.
Maybe some of the participants could comment on that.
Faisal?
Yes, it is. I would like just to say something like, meaning that, if you make the communication, please use the language that they're using.
Exactly. Exactly. You are from Indonesia. You have Bahasa Indonesia, Indonesian as your national language and your official language. But if you are writing a scientific paper in sociolinguistics or in medicine, if you don't write it in English or if you don't write it in French, it doesn't get the same recognition as if you write in Bahasa Indonesian. And yet, being from Indonesia, as a researcher, doing research for your own people, who do you want to talk to first? Do you want to talk to people outside Indonesia first, or do you want to talk to your own people first? Because the results of your research, if they are to be implemented, will be implemented in Indonesia one day.
Yeah.
But that's the conundrum that we are caught in. It's the same in Cote d'Ivoire. We have to publish in international journals to be recognized. In fact, there are many African journals, to be honest with you, simply because they don't prosper. Anyone who has the possibility of publishing overseas doesn't waste their time publishing in the African journals. See?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a real problem because it's not just about the individual researchers. It's also about the kind of stuff that one might feel pressurized into publishing that actually has no relevance for the countries to which one belongs and feels affiliated. So, for example, my home country is South Africa. Now, many of my colleagues in South Africa now feel that they have to write about multilingualism and use the lens on multilingualism that they find in the literature from North America and the UK, for example. Now, we have had a long history of studying multilingualism in South Africa, learning from our African colleagues. But nobody wants to look at that. Instead, they insist on filtering their understanding or their literature publications through the lens of a North American or European lens. Then they make recommendations to governments based on that lens about what should happen in schools and how to implement multilingual education in schools. And it's completely irrelevant. It's highly problematic, and it's not going to help the situation. So this kind of publication is very dangerous. So that, for me, is one of the worst things about the lingering consequences of coloniality, that academics are, in a sense, being obliged to repeat coloniality in their literature, when in actual fact, it's damaging for their countries and the students in schools and universities.
And the pressure also comes from the Western world, whereby they make available grants to academics to study specific areas for their own benefit, but not for the benefit of the researchers in their own countries. So studying, what do you call it? Looking at contrastive analysis of French and Bahasa Indonesia, for instance. Who does that serve most? Why not do a study on Bahasa Indonesia per se? That would be much more relevant to the country. This is what happens with African academics. In other words, our governments do not invest in research. The only way an academic can have support is to look at the possibility of getting a grant from one of those international organizations, Francophonie, or what's your British organization, IWEL? What's
British
that one?
Council. British
The
Council.
British. Okay, and that's what people strive to get, and when they get those, they have to write through, as you're saying, through a particular lens to get their papers accepted, right? And that lens is the lens coming from the global north, which does not reflect the realities of the global south. So you have to be an established academic to get your point of view through, even in your own country, all right? So that's the sort of issues. And in the paper that I published in the IJSL, I brought out this sort of problem, that the reason why you don't have a lot of African academics publishing in international journals is because there is that pressure, that constraint, that imposed view that if you want to publish in this particular paper, you have to go along with our way of looking at this particular issue. But your way of looking at the particular issue in the Western world does not explain what happens in a developing country.
Yeah. I see that there's a question from Ibu Arita. Would you like to ask your question, Ibu?
Yeah, thank you, Haiwa. Thank you, Paulin, Djite. I would like to ask about a language that, as we know, language is very important component in education, and teaching material in school is delivered through the use of language. It is crucial for students, especially elementary school students, to be able to understand the language of the schools, but unfortunately, the language of home and the language of school do not always match. What do you think about the best teaching method and literacy practices need to be employed to ensure that all students receive equal access to the education? Thank you.
That's a tough question. I'm only a small researcher in my own corner. This is a question we should put to UNESCO or something like that. But to be honest with you, there are some countries, as I said before, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, where they have managed to develop national printing houses for the national languages. And so they produce material in national languages that are used in the first 5-6 years of schooling in those countries. And there are lots of them. So that's one way of doing it. Of course, the publications are not terribly fancy, you know, like when you get a book published in France or in England, it looks luxurious, it looks nice. It's the paper can last for a number of years, but at least they produce their own language material. This is a very important issue in Africa. We don't have a lot of publishing houses, especially when it comes to educational material. In Cote d'Ivoire, as I speak, all 100% of all the books that are produced for elementary school, secondary school, universities are printed in France and brought here through the ministries and sold here. We don't produce one single book. So again, the issue with language, in other words, if we wanted to produce language materials in the national languages for our children here, we don't have any printing press that will be able to do it. You understand?
Yeah. That reminds me of an experience I had in Gabon a few years ago. I was visiting schools in different parts of Gabon, and one school I picked up a history book. This is a secondary school, lycée. And the book was produced in France, and the lessons were about the Renaissance, the Counter-Reformation, very, very European Franco perspective. And I asked the head teacher, why? This is all about Europe. And he said, but it's universal. The history is universal. So the history of what was happening in France is actually universal history. Yeah. Anyway, I think Kathleen has another observation to make. And then after that, I think we have to stop.
Close. Okay.
Oh, no, don't worry about me. I'm just filling up the space. People can look at it later. I'm sure other people have got more interesting questions and clarifications they'd like to ask Paulin.
Are there any more questions? I think that's it. Your presentation, Paulin, and your discussion with Kathleen has brought all sorts of things to my mind. One is that since the universal experience of COVID, I think people in several parts of the world have become aware of the importance of communicating health information in languages that people actually understand. And I've done some research on this with an Indonesian colleague here, looking at the information that's provided by local health authorities, district and provincial health authorities, and they're using the national language mixed with a lot of English terms. Very, very few of them have used local languages that will be immediately understandable. And I think I've read of similar research in the Philippines, in Mexico, and other parts of the world. I think this possibly a positive consequence, a side effect of COVID, is that people are beginning to think about the importance of communicating important information in languages that people actually understand. Right. I think, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Really interesting discussion. Many thanks, Paulin.
Howell, can I just say one thing about Paulin?
Yes, go on.
When Paulin was asking, what do people think about Africa? What sort of views do you have? One thing I would like to say is it took Paulin, a scholar from Africa, to change a great deal about language policy in Australia many years ago. It took an African scholar to actually ensure that the Sydney Olympics were won by Australia, because without Paulin's understanding of multilingualism and how to provide multilingual language services, Australia would not have won the Sydney Olympics bid. Wow. It was Paulin's intervention that actually nailed it for Australia. So I just want to say that African scholars have made a massive contribution all over the world, and they're very seldom recognized for the contributions that they do make. So Paulin is one of my heroes, always has been.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. And to add to what you just said, Brisbane will be organizing the next Olympic Games in 2032. And I translated the whole bid volumes to the IOC. So that's what I'm very proud of. My grandchildren will go to Brisbane knowing that their granddad played a little part in that.
Wow, fantastic.
That's wonderful. Fantastic. Absolutely wonderful. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
A really good discussion.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, I think we have to stop here, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paulin. Thank you, Howell.
Thank you.